Hi, my name is Chris, aka The Philosopher's Games, or TPH Games as my little games channel here is called. And often people complain about the car handling in Cyberpunk 2077, and luckily for the PC players, there are several mods that kind of improve it. One mod I want to show you today is Cyber Vehicle Overhaul, and it only requires Cyber Engine tweaks, so you need two mods for that. And the best part is that you can also adjust all the values for every car in the game using this mod. You can of course either use what the modder has predefined in his mod, or you can also fine-tune every car individually to your desire with it. And that is pretty powerful. The modder of Cyber Vehicle Overhaul also made a mod called Car Modification Shop, and this allows you to buy upgrades for each car, and what it does is basically also changing exactly these values that you can also change with a text editor. And I guess it helps though understanding what these values do exactly, and this is what we will look in this video today, a little bit at least. It's quite complex and I won't cover everything, but you can actually do quite a lot with this mod and have a lot of options. If you have seen the last video on my channel where I drive around with this little funny my car at absurd speeds and jump over a river with it, that I also did with this particular mod, and it was very fun playing around with it. That is what I like doing most, just see what is possible, maybe making a car absurdly fast and then have a bit of fun after having completed the game. So that's also a use case. Or you could just seriously tune your cars and improve the handling as you like it. That is also an option, but this of course needs a lot of trial and error, I think. But let us start. The first step is you have to install the mods. I made a video where I explain this in all detail using Vortex, the mod manager of nexusmods.com, which I would recommend if you want to use many mods. It makes it easier once it's set up, but setting it up is an extra step. You can also install the mods manually, and what you need to do is just open the main folder of your Cyberpunk 2077 installation and extract the downloaded zip file for Cyber Engine tweaks and for Cyber Vehicle Overhaul into your main folder. That's basically everything you need to do. Cyber Vehicle Overhaul does not really need any further configuration, it just runs, and you notice it working by some of the cars like the Caliber and suddenly go much faster than before. Cyber Engine tweaks, a mod that the other mod requires, you can test though, for example in the main menu or in the game. I think on the US keyboard you have to press the / key, on the German it would be the circumflex, and it of course depends on your keyboard layout which key it is, so maybe you have to try out a little bit depending on where you're from. But pressing the key should open the Cyber Engine Tweaks menu, and pressing it again closes it. We don't have to set up there anything for this mod, so you can ignore it. It's just there to test if it works. Just for completeness sake, if you in addition decide to install also the Car Modification Shop mod, then on the map there should also be an icon for that. It's a physical location on the map and you have to drive there to use this shop. I should also mention that all these mods work on 2.02 with Phantom Liberty, so the current version of the game. And in my experience, should there be a new version of the game, all you need to do is really update Cyber Engine tweaks and then the mods should work again. If you now don't plan on tuning the cars further than what the mod does in its base configuration, then you're already done and can just load into the game and try the cars out. And I think even if you want to tune specific cars further, I would still recommend to just try out the mod a little bit and see what it does, and if you like the behavior of the cars now a bit more. However, if you now want to tune your cars further or even over-tune them, we have to take a look into the mods files for each car. And for that we will need a text editor. You can just use the classic Windows Notepad, you could even use the Windows Word thing, or Notepad++ or Visual Studio Code or whatever you like. There are different things, maybe I'll link some in the description. I would recommend using something like Notepad or one of these code editors because they save the file guaranteed as a plain text file and don't add any formatting information like font size or font type or whatever. If you do this, the file won't work anymore. It has to be a plain text file. That's very important. Next, we have to open the folder where all these LUA files of the mod are stored in. Each car has its own LUA file and some cars are missing, unfortunately. You also need to know how the car is called so you find the fitting file for it. If the file is not there, you need to create one, and this I maybe also shortly explain at the end of the video. From the main folder of the game you find those LUA files in the folder Bine, x64, plugins, Cyber Engine tweaks, mods, Cyber Vehicle Overhaul modules. And in modules you find for each car its own LUA file. As said, if a file is missing, you can create your own, but it has some downsides. We come later to that. Now, as an example for modifying the values in one of these LUA files, we choose the Archer Heller ECD. In the folder, the file is called Archer Heller Tweak.lua. Editing the base values is pretty much every time the same for each file, though there are some special values that are missing in some files. In theory you could add them, but it becomes a bit more complicated doing this. If you now open the .lua or .lua file of your choice, it should look something like this. Here I opened the Archer Heller Tweak.lua in my case, but this should look similar for a lot of or most cars in the game with some small differences here and there. If you now want to edit some of these base values, just edit the number after the equal sign. Keep everything else as it was before, like the name of the variable, the formatting and so on. Just only change the number. Let us now look into some of these values. Most of them are pretty self-explanatory, but if you're not a native speaker like me, you might wonder what some of these values actually do, and I try to explain that in a moment. Also, the Archer Heller ECD, the standard starting car in the game, is not a good pick for this video, but I go with it anyway to show you some potential hiccups. I explain why it's problematic in a moment as well. Also, if you change some values, especially if you take some extreme values, it can happen that on the first loading, when you load a save game, the game might crash. Just try it again and then it should work. If you do something completely wrong though, the game might crash constantly. If you want to see the changes you have made in the LUA file in-game, you have to close the game and load into the save game again to see it. In theory, you can of course do it using Cyber Engine tweaks, and there the Tweak DB tab, and there you can change the values directly. Usually also there should reload a save game, but you don't have to close the game completely doing that. Though it's a bit cumbersome to work with these tables and all these values there. If you now open the Archer Heller Tweak.lua, it should look something like this. Also any other script file. And now we come to why the Archer Heller is a bad example, because it seems like there's a little mistake or error in the script and some values don't work or are not applied properly. And you can fix this very easily, and in case in any other script you have a similar problem where suddenly the values don't work, this is a way to fix it. And for that we have to scroll down into the cloning section of this script, and there we find basically two variants of deployment methods, how these values get into the database later in the game and change the values. And one is called cloned variable load, the other is basic variable load. The reason why there are two is if you change the basic variables, you change basically all the cars that use this, at least I guess in some cases. So it makes sense to make a copy of that, change the copy and keep the other cars that use the other data set intact. That's basically the idea. In this case, if you use specifically the player car though, it should only affect the player car anyway, except you set it up a bit differently. We'll maybe come to this later, but it is unfortunately a bit complicated. And what we now can do is add two hyphens in front of a line. That is a common function of the script language. So everything after these two hyphens or two minuses or whatever the symbol is called in English will be ignored. So we just comment out the cloned variable load completely or only the last three lines, and then we remove the hyphens for each line in the basic variable load, or only the three lines if you use this, because the mistake or the little error is only in these last three lines. That is the vehicle setup, the front wheel suspension, the rear wheel suspension. That is what is not working correctly. And once that is done, it should look something like this. Just be careful that you don't accidentally remove the hyphens in front of a line that is an actual comment like basic variable load. There need to be 2 hyphens in front of that because it just tells us what this following lines are for. So if you ever encounter the problem that you change values and nothing happens in-game, it could have to do something with this, but I think most scripts you find in this mod use the basic variable load instead of the cloned variable load and will work probably. Only some cars do it differently, just so you know that this can be a problem that occurs, but maybe it only is a problem with the header though. And now, after so many explanations, we can finally start looking into one of these files and see what happens if we change the values. And I can already spoil it will be a lot of fun messing around with these values. I think one thing that a lot of people might want to change is the max speed of a car and the acceleration. Unfortunately, changing this is at least a little bit more complicated than people might think, though there is an easy way. For the beginning, we will look into a value called MaxTorque pretty much at the beginning of the file. And that is mostly about acceleration, but a little bit also about the max speed of the car. It changes that slightly as well. If we look into the unmodified base game, we see that my example car that I chose for this video, the Archer Heller, goes round about 103 miles per hour. If you install Cyber Vehicle Overhaul, the base value of the mod brings this car to around about 145, 150. So quite a bit faster. If we now look into our file at the beginning and increase the max torque by factor 10 to 4225 and load back into the game, we will notice that our wheels are now spinning really hard and our acceleration is pretty great, but at the very end, we are only slightly faster than before. Now we reach like 154 miles per hour. So even though we increased our torque by factor 10, we only get like a little increase in max speed. And of course, max torque is unfortunately not a good way to increase your max speed, only your acceleration. However, if we scroll down a little bit in the file, go to gears, we see that for each gear you can make settings, and one of these settings is gear's max speed. We look for simplicity at the last gear, in my case the 6, there can be 7 max, and change there the max speed to 240, let's say. Load back into the game and see what happens if we reach the last gear. Suddenly we go faster than 150 and even go to 230. That is faster than a base game Caliburn. So that worked pretty well, and this is the way how to do it. You can of course fine-tune this for every gear as much as you want. If we now combine this also with a max torque setting, we also get a far better acceleration. It's kind of interesting to see as soon as the car hits the last gear, it suddenly goes forward quite a bit. But at the very end, we see again that we are not that much faster than without the higher torque setting. Like a little bit, we definitely see an increase here, but it's not that big. Further, there's another way to increase the speed, the airResistanceFactor. If we decrease it from 1.8 to 0.4, load back into the game and see what happens, we'll notice that our car suddenly accelerates a little bit better even, I guess, and also later on reaches much higher speeds. Like, it's absolutely insane what the difference is here. Suddenly we go far beyond 400 miles per hour. In comparison, a Caliburn in the base game is 210 roundabout. So that is pretty insane, and we have to even lower the max gear speed just to not reach the max speed in the game. However, there is still another way to influence the max speed and especially the acceleration of your car, and that is over the friction of your wheels, your tires. You have 2 different friction settings for each pair of wheels, so for the front wheels and for the rear wheels. One is the lateral friction for going sideways. We come later to this. This is very important for car handling. And then we have the longitudinal friction. This is the friction for going forward. And that is what we will focus on here in this section. If you increase the longitudinal friction, you accelerate suddenly much faster and also potentially reach higher speeds. I guess simply because your wheels can't spin and leave these marks behind anymore on the ground, and you just put everything of rotation of your wheels into going forward in the physics engine thing here, and as a result you just go very, very fast and accelerate like absolute crazy if you set this to a value of like 4.6 or 4.8, which is a far too high value already to just give you an idea. Maybe set this around 1.8 or something if you want a more realistic value, but just for demonstration's sake we put this to 4.8 and you see what the car's just doing. It's kind of ridiculous. We even reach the max speed in the game possible, which is 460 miles per hour. And if you reach this speed in the game thinks, wait a moment, something is wrong, and just resets the speed of your car back to 0, which is very annoying. As a result, you should always adjust your values for your cars in a way that you stay below that value and maybe aim for 450 miles per hour, because the game is not designed in a way that it supports this. Maybe because it can't load the assets fast enough anymore, or some other reasons. Also, changing the longitudinal friction has an impact on, you guessed it, braking the car. So if you now hit the brake, the car stops instantly and flips over at a high enough speed, and that's also quite funny to look at. You can even make a full front flip with this and stuff like this. I also love that now if you call or summon your car and it slowly drives towards you and hits the brake, it now also flips over and lands on its roof. I think it's absolutely hilarious to see this, and I might make a little short out of this later, but yeah, you definitely see how the game is not designed around the idea having this setting so high. Interestingly, if you now accelerate and turn the car a bit to the side, you still notice that you slide, because going sidewards is still part of the lateral friction, and we will discuss this value later in the video, and it's of course very important for the car handling. You might also notice in the footage that the distance between the body of the car and the tires is quite a bit high. You can lower this with a setting called VisualSuspensionDroop. It also exists for the rear and the front tires, and then bring the tires or the wheels closer to the body, and it looks a little bit better as a result. I put it to a value of minus 0.014, then it looks something like this, so much better. You can go with a negative value here. By default in the file it's 0.14, that's far too much. But you might also wonder, Chris, what happens if I put this setting to, let's say, 5.15? Well, then it looks like this, and it looks absolutely hilarious as well. Unfortunately, the car is now almost impossible to control, but it's still funny to see that this works and you can do funny stuff like that, but I would not recommend doing this. Further, you also notice another setting maybe called vertical offset for the wheels, and this value moves the position of the wheels up and down, I think. And I would not recommend messing with this particular value, because you can move the wheels in a way that they are below the ground, and then the car doesn't drive anymore correctly. So I would recommend using the suspension droop instead of the vertical offset. So leave the vertical offset where it is. A reason why this is so weirdly set up here for the Heller by default might be that these settings of the wheel setup didn't work before, until we changed manually in the file how the variable load works. And you remember the beginning section of the video. I assume that's why it's by default set in such a weird way. This is also mostly only a visual thing, it seems, though. If I put the setting to a very high value, it also has an impact on how the car handles. Another setting you maybe want to change, and it's a lot of fun to mess around with this, is the total mass. Change the total mass and not the total chassis mass. And let's say we put this to 170,000, you see that your car suddenly doesn't care anymore if you hit another car, no matter how big. You just push everything to the side, and I had a lot of fun recording this, I can tell you that for a fact. it was really fun, but it doesn't really mess around with how the car handles. But if you put a high value onto this, it can happen that your car might clip through the floor and you just fall and have to load a save game. The next setting I would like to talk about are the RPM, or revolutions per minute, not rounds per minute. I think that is for guns. At the beginning of the file you find min RPM and max RPM, and those define, as I understand it, the range or the RPM range of your car. Then in the gear settings you also have a min and max RPM setting for each gear, and this makes this kind of bit of work to set up correctly. It changes around how the motor sounds, as you would expect if you tune this, and also has an impact, I think, on the acceleration, further on how hard the wheels rotate as a result, and spin and leave the marks behind if you set this up wrong. I would recommend to not mess around with this too much if you don't want to invest too much time into this setup here. However, for demonstration's sake, we only focus on the last gear and set the max RPM at the beginning of the file to 20,000 and the max RPM for the 6th gear here in my case also to 20,000. And then if we load into the game and reach the 6th gear, we notice that this little RPM bar is not completely filled and slowly fills. We notice that the motor sound is now different, starts low and gets higher, and the acceleration is not optimal. And this is basically what the RPM settings in combination with the gears do. If you set up the gear settings wrong, the gears won't shift correctly anymore, so be careful there as well. And also consider that the shifting the gears is also here tied to the speed of the car. As soon as you reach the next gear, the car is automatically set to the min RPM setting of the next gear, and so on. So keep this kind of in mind, and this is how you can fine-tune this to your desire. If you have a lot of acceleration, you might need more range in the RPM for the gears, maybe, because else you rush through it really fast and so on, and the motor sound can get very annoying. So messing around with the gears is definitely something that takes a bit of work, simply because you have to fine-tune it for every gear. But I think it's quite cool that you can actually change all this to this detail. You can also add gears to a max of 7, and you can also remove gears to a minimum of 1, I think. And so you have quite a few options with this, and it can be, for some people for sure, pretty fun to mess around with this. One thing I noticed though is no matter how fast your car goes forward, the backward speed is always limited to like 30 miles per hour. And I wondered, why is that? And then I noticed if you increase the RPM, you actually increase the max speed of going backwards. If we put the max RPM setting at the beginning of the file to 20k, suddenly the car goes 170 miles per hour backwards. So if you want to put it to the extreme, then set the max RPM setting to around about 100,000 and you might reach 450 miles per hour backwards, but it becomes then quite difficult to control this car backwards. It has a tendency to turn around. The next value I want to talk about is the turning roll factor. And you're probably aware that in Cyberpunk, if your front wheels are not connected to the street anymore, so in the air, then you can't go left or right, and you lose control of your car. So you want to avoid this state. And the turning roll factor determines how much your car tries to flip on its roof when you drive around a bend, so go left or right. And the default value is 0.8, I put it to 1.9, and you see if I go left and right that the car is just consistently only on 2 wheels. So 1.9 I figured out is kind of the limit for the car to not flip over consistently. If you go above 1.9, above 2.0, then at least the Heller wants to be on its roof and flip around consistently, and becomes almost impossible to go around bends anymore. Maybe you want to play a little bit around this if you want to drive on 2 wheels or something, but usually if you want your car to be able to take really sharp turns, you put this to a very low value, like we're talking 0.4 or even 0.1 if you want to put it to an extreme. Speaking of wheels not being on the ground, There is another interesting setting called the SpringStiffness. It's, I think, by default at around about 38. And if we put it to 80, load into the game, you will see what happens. And it's kind of hilarious to look at it, but it makes it impossible to control the car. It just jumps around like crazy because this value is far too high and should be much, much lower. You can still drive with it, but as soon as you hit like a bump, the car just starts bumping around out of control. If you put this to 5,000, your car just goes flying all the time, which can also be funny, but I would not recommend it. It has a bit of this, I don't know, lowrider style, which can be funny as well. In some cases, for my little My video, also set this higher than it should be, which made the car really very hard to control. But if you want to have a much better control of the car, put this lower. And also if you want to go through the desert without the car just consistently flying up and down all the time, put this to a very low value, like 5 or something. But then you notice that your wheels are consistently below the surface. You might be able to fine-tune this and play a little bit around with maybe the suspension droop or something that might help to get the wheels above the ground again. But if you want that your car controls really well, put it to a lower value. Also, there is one value for the front wheels and one for the rear wheels. We already talked about the turning roll factor, and one other value that kind of counters it is the SwaybarStiffness front and rear value. This kind of prevents the car from flipping over when you drive left or right. And you see now the car controls pretty well. And even if I now put the turning roll factor very high, it kind of tries to counter it, and the car just almost break dances if you do this, because these two factors try to cancel each other out. But yeah, I would not recommend you running a setting like this. Just keep the turning roll factor lower. That's usually, I think, the better option, but this can definitely help a little bit. And now, finally, we come to maybe one of the most important factors for car handling in the game, and that is the already mentioned lateral friction. This, as jump and run players would call it, reduces the ice physics of the car, so it slides less if you go left and right. That is very important, especially if you want to take very sharp turns with your car at high speeds. Here, for the demonstration's sake, we put this to like 2.64 and 2.88. You have one setting for the front wheel, one for the rear wheels. And if you now load into the game, you, with this setting, already notice that we can take very sharp turns and the car is just not sliding, even if we go like 100 or something like this, which is very impressive already. It doesn't look that impressive, I think, but if you know how the car slides left and right at these speeds normally, then you definitely notice that this now controls much, much better versus before. But a bit of sliding is definitely needed, so you will most likely play around with this value quite a lot to find the perfect sweet spot for you. And I can already tell 1.8, 1.5 is pretty much a very good value if you want a more realistic handling, and if you want to do crazy stuff, then put it definitely above 1.8 or even 2. Another value that is in this context very interesting is the MaxWheelTurnDeg degree. And this just increases how strong your car can turn around. As you can see here, I put it like to 70, which is a very extreme value. And now the car is able to just turn really, really sharp all of a sudden. And even at very high speeds and so on. So if you want to put it to the extreme, yeah, this is potentially the value to look out for, in addition to the friction. And especially if you go at very high speeds, you still might need to increase the friction if you want to do very, very crazy stuff. The other two values, the turn max at per second and turn max sub per second, determine, as far as I understand it, how fast the angle of your front wheel changes when you steer to the left or to the right. And as a result, if you put this to a very low value, going left or right is suddenly very delayed and feels very clunky. The next setting is also an interesting one, but I guess also very special, and most people won't need it. It's called ResistanceTorque, and it determines how much the car slows down when you let go of the acceleration key or button. engine braking basically. And if we put this to 10,000, a very extreme value, load into the game, go really fast, and I just let go of the acceleration button, I'm not hitting the brakes here, you see just how strongly the car is braking here, and due to the high friction setting I set up before, it even flips over because of that. So that is what you can do with this. And this is basically everything. We have the wheel resistance ratio. I just would not mess around with this value. It's like a combination for the friction values or something like that. So it has some impact there as well. But maybe you're interested in adding gears or removing gears. So let's look into this. There's amount of gears, and you have to set this to the amount of gears you want to have. 7 is the maximum as far as I'm aware. And all you need to do, let's say we have here like this 6 gears and want to add a 7th one. We have to just copy paste, let's say the 6th gear, and just remove the 6 in the these brackets with a 7, and then set up the values that it kind of makes sense. And then below we have this list here, and we have this inline gear 6. Here we need to add a comma to it and then add another line that basically says inline gear 7 at the end. Don't put a comma at the end, else potentially it won't work. And when you then have tuned the 7th gear as well to your desire, it should already work. That's everything you need to do. It's actually relatively easy. In case you want to remove all the gears, you have to basically do the opposite of what we just did. Just mark every gear you don't want to have, remove them, switch the number to 1, and also remove the inline gears, except for inline gear 0 and 1. You have to keep the 0, and that one doesn't count. As said, I think 7 is a max and 1 is the lowest. Maybe you can also remove the first gear as well, and then the car doesn't drive anymore, or it crashes the game. I haven't tried that, but that is your scope here. And if we load into the game, we see the first gear, the second, the third, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, and at the very end also we hear the 7th gear. And that's basically how this works. Then one of the last things I want to explain is how to add new cars to this that are not part of the mod. For example, the mod is unfortunately not updated with the new Phantom Liberty cars yet, and the reason is it's a lot of work, as you can see, to tweak every car. So maybe the modder at some point will add them. If you want to do this yourself, it is also possible. There is on the modding page a template file for these files here that you could modify, or use an existing one. I would, for example, think of a similar car, use this file and make some changes to the file, and then it already works. A good example might be in Phantom Liberty, the Outlaw GTS Weiler, which is because the Outlaw GTS already exists in the base game, so you can just use that one. For this to work, you have to copy the existing file then and name it in a unique way. The name doesn't really matter. I called it Herrera Outlaw PT for Phantom Liberty. Then I just have the same stuff written then in the other file and have to make very few changes to make this actually work. First of all, I have to change Herrera Outlaw GTS Handling Tweaks E1. This name I have to change in the new file to a unique one. Again, I just wanted to make it shorter, so I just called it Herrera Outlaw GTS W for Weiler. Maybe I should have called it PT or something like this, so that this works. And then you also have the function there. You have to put in the same name. Now the description you can also change, but I think it's not that important, but maybe just change it. And then down at the file, you have return, and there also we have to put, in my case, Herrera Outlaw GTS W. And that's almost it. Like, you have to change the function, the beginning, the return at the end, and then in the file itself, you have to change also something. There is a line called vehicle name, and this is how the vehicle is called in the database of the game internally. And usually, or in some cases, you don't have to put player behind it. In this case, it makes sense because this car is unique. So in this case, Sports Herrera Outlaw Heist Player. The vehicle.v underscore is added in another line, so you can leave this out, even though it would be part of the actual name. It's a bit complicated. In theory, you could also just write it in the full vehicle name like this if you would want to. But I can definitely see why it's programmed here like this, because in many cases there exist multiple versions of the car in the game, you find in the streets and so on, and in the traffic. So to maybe change these cars as well or not, you have to consider this. However, in this particular case, I went with the player name, and then at setting the data to specified vehicles, this line alone is enough, the set vehicle settings. There are some other vehicle names here now in comments, so that they are ignored. But yeah, in maybe some other cases, you might want to add those other names there that exist, or other versions of the car that exist, if you want them to have the same behavior. Then, for example, in our case, the player car. The player cars always end with underscore player at the end of this name. And yeah, always starts with vehicle.v underscore and then sports or standard 2 or whatever. You find these specific names of the car. I link you in the description a list with all the names for the player cars at least. If you want more names, you have to check this via Cyber Engine tweaks. Press a button in the game, press on tweak DB, and then you have to search the name for these cars in there. There are records for it, and as said, you just search for vehicle.v or something, you might find them already. And then you can add these cars here as well. That's basically all you have to do, which is relatively easy. In theory, you could have also added the Herrera Outlaw Weiler to the other Outlaw file as well using this method. If you do this though, the machine gun of the car won't work anymore. So in this case, it makes sense to actually create a new file for that. You could in theory also change weapons and stuff. I have not really experimented with this, but this would go too far. But from here, if you want also add new values to this file, you have to go into Cyber Engine Tweaks in-game, load the tweak DB, and look up how these values are called in-game, and then add them here accordingly to this file. Just, I don't know, if there's, for example, a torque setting for the handbrake that you could add. You find this in the Javeliner thing. You could also copy how it's set up in the Javeliner thing into your other files if you're understanding how this here works a little bit better. If you have no clue what I'm even talking about, I would recommend not messing around with this then. It's very difficult to explain, I think, if you don't know what's going on. But basically these tweak db colon set flat and then what comes after that is the actual lines that changes the values in game. And the middle part, in this case max braking torque, is a specific value that you set there. And you could add more of these lines with the other values and change them as well. Not always, only with certain values, because some other values are more complex and so on. But I hope you kind of get the idea how this works. Also, if you add a car and you have no base values for this, no references for this, you can go into the game, try to find the car in-game using tweakdb and get the values that you want to set in these files from there. That is how the modder, I think, did it as well. And you see how much work that is. That's why it takes some time to update a mod like this. So much respect to the modder and shoutouts to him, because I think he did a fantastic job with this. And it's really cool that we can mess around a little bit with some values here and there. And this brings us to the end of the video. It got a very long video because this is quite a complex topic with a lot of details, but I hope this was in any shape or form interesting or helpful for some of you who might be interested into fine-tuning their cars a little bit. If you found this in any shape or form useful and interesting, please press the like button, maybe leave a comment if you like this, or if you have questions, feel free to ask too, and also press subscribe and the annoying bell if you want. so that would be much appreciated. Also, don't annoy the modder if you kind of messed up in your files and destroyed something because you messed around with the files. That's not my intention to cause problems here, just for people who are interested to be able to maybe change some values, because it's, for the most part, relatively easy if you stick to the base values of each car. Shoutouts again to all the people supporting this channel here. Thank you very much for that, much appreciated. Thank you for watching, and see you people next time. Goodbye.